Absolutely. I'm Christina Medland. I'm one of Meridian's managing partners, and I am the head of our Canadian practice and our North American East Coast practice. Thank you so very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking some time to spend with us. I think this session is going to be interesting and hopefully also practical and have some ideas that you can implement. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, who is Andrew Conradi. Andrew?
Well, thank you, Chris. And I'll just reiterate, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And good morning. My name is Andrew Conradi. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet just yet, I'm a senior consultant with Meridian out of our Toronto office, and I will be our host and moderator for today's session. First off, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend this with us. We know everybody on this call has plenty of competing interests for your time and a limited number of hours to give, quite frankly. So we hope that we can make good use of this one together and leave you with some valuable takeaways at the end. Some of you who were with us last year may recall that we spoke a lot at that time about change and the need to design resilient compensation plans that are appropriately flexible and adaptable to emerging circumstances, giving management and committees, many of yourselves on this call, loose enough reins to really exercise informed business judgment while still having a framework that holds fast to the core principles, what we might think of as the evergreen best practices related to things like market competitiveness, shareholder alignment, pay for performance culture, things like that. Well, crying change is coming from the rooftops is a pretty reliable way for us to be, Chicken Little or an accurate but pretty uninteresting forecaster. So we're not going to leap to pat ourselves on the back for predicting the state of things today, in which the world really continues to be one that is awash in change. Economic change, environmental change, regulatory and cultural change, political change, and geopolitical change, frankly. And with all of their interrelated and interconnected impact on the work that we do. With the recent turbulence across many or really all of these domains in the business world and more specifically in the world of publicly traded companies, we're seeing a real evolution in investor and stakeholder expectations, associated shifts in industry, regulatory, market norms that we've been accustomed to for some time. And that can potentially, disrupt the status quo of compensation programs that have been ticking along, working as expected up to this point. Can drive unexpected or unintended outcomes that perhaps don't align with the company's performance, goals, or maybe some of the new stakeholder expectations that we're contending with. Today's briefing aims to provide you all with some insights from our experts, my colleagues, on some of the factors at play that can really drive these changes to executive compensation and compensation decision-making. And also provide a little bit of sage advice to keep in mind as you navigate these and similar changes through your own organizations. As usual, to try to keep ourselves on track and somewhat organized, we've divided the rest of the day's talk into 4 parts. First off, Rachel Lee will be giving us an update on Say on Pay results for the 2023 proxy season. Also some insights on what we can tell from those findings related to the proxy advisors and perhaps also their institutional investor clients that we know so well. Matt Cito will be taking us through an overview of shareholder engagement, which is a watchword that I suspect many of you around the room have been hearing more and more over the last year or perhaps 18 months. And go over some of the key do's and don'ts, things to watch out for to really maximize the benefit of whatever engagement you do decide to undertake. Andrew McElhern will be discussing the challenge of activist investors. Frankly, we'll talk a lot today about engaging with shareholders in general, but how specifically do you handle shareholders who are coming to the table with a different agenda, who have this desire to affect particular change? Is there a different playbook compared to regular or conventional investors? Andrew will fill us in on all of that. Finally, our last speaker, Andrew Stansel, will be leading us through some strategies and considerations for a particular kind of change that, again, I'm sure we have some experience with around this room. CEO transitions, be they slow, methodical, well-planned, immediate, wholly unexpected bolts from the blue, or any or everywhere in between. There are some key things that we can keep in mind as you chart the course for your own company through those challenging waters sometimes. And Andrew's going to highlight some of those along with some pitfalls that we may want to avoid. A couple of quick housekeeping items as I wrap up my remarks. Of course, as always, we're going to reserve some time at the end for Q&A. So please do feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the conversation using the Q&A buttons, which I believe appear at the bottom of your screen. Zoom interface is slightly different for different folks sometimes, but if you can find the Q&A button, that's where you want to be. There's an option to do so anonymously if you prefer, but if you do attach your name and we're unable to get to your question within the available time, we'd certainly be happy to follow up with you afterwards. Now, with all that being said, and since we do have quite a full agenda this morning, I'm going to pause for a moment and share my screen, and then I'm going to turn things over to, pardon me, search my window here. There we are. Kick off the presentation with my colleague, Rachel Lee. Take it away, Rachel.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. For this part of the briefing, I will be providing an update on the proxy season in Canada and the US and notable say-on-pay observations. In terms of Canadian voting results, ISS has recommended against say-on-pay at 7 companies, of which 4 have passed, those being Colliers, GFL, Restaurant Brands, and Shopify, with average vote support of 74% across these companies. 3 companies have failed say-on-pay, being Agnico Eagle, First Majestic Silver, and OpenText Corporation. Now, our analysis concluded that the companies which failed had some combination of the following problematic pay practices: a pay-for-performance misalignment, a lack of meaningful response to low say-on-pay results in the previous year, mega one-time cash bonuses without rigorous performance criteria, and uncapped bonuses measured on single metrics. Now, in our view, you almost have to work to fail say-on-pay, particularly in Canada. And from our experience, it's generally a combination of poor performance, outsized compensation, or providing one-time mega bonuses, plus undertaking another action that is viewed negatively by stakeholders, which together will likely culminate in a say-on-pay failure. Based on our experience, other factors that could contribute to an against recommendation include a lack of performance-based long-term incentives, inadequate disclosure of incentive plan targets or targets that lower than prior year's actual results, awarding guaranteed compensation, or having a peer group viewed as being aspirational. Next slide, please. We have a few interesting observations coming out of the Canadian proxy season. The average level of support amongst this TSX composite is consistent with last year at 92%. The percentage of companies in the yellow card zone, however, those are companies receiving between 50 to 80% votes in favor, is the highest it's been since 2019, and the number of companies that failed say-on-pay is the lowest it's been since 2020. So put differently, we're seeing fewer failures, but a greater number of companies in that 50 to 80% bucket. And just a note, for companies receiving less than 80% support, the proxy advisors expect more robust engagement with shareholders and disclosure of both the engagement efforts and any compensation changes made in the proxy circular prior to the next annual meeting. It's important to note that ISS only recommended against 4% of companies in the composite. So in our view, the reason why we're seeing lower vote outcomes is really twofold. The first being Glass Lewis recommended against at 3 times the rate of ISS, representing 13% of companies on the composite. And now anecdotally, we know that Glass Lewis has less influence on vote outcomes. So the higher prevalence of yellow card scores may also be evidence of institutional investor policies diverging from those of proxy advisors. The investors with the largest holdings in companies in the yellow card zone are BlackRock, Vanguard, Vanek Associates, RBC Global Asset Management, and Jarolowski Fraser. Our last observation on the Canadian proxy season is that we noted an emphasis on companies in the real estate sector and the material and mining sector receiving the most against recommendations from Glass Lewis. Next slide, please. Switching gears to south of the border, in terms of US say-on-pay results, 72% of the Russell 3000 have received at least 90% support. ISS has recommended against say-on-pay at 12% of the Russell 3000, with average support amongst those companies at 68%. 47 proposals have failed, with notable failures including Broadcom, Netflix, Simon Property, Equifax, and American International Group. We're also observing similar trends in the US with fewer failures year over year, however, but a declining proportion of companies receiving 90% plus support. That wraps up my comments on the proxy season update. I'm happy to discuss any questions during our Q&A. And in the meantime, back to you, Andrew Conradi.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Great stuff. Always helpful to get an update on where things are trending in terms of actual outcomes over the course of the year. Next, we're going to turn to Matt Cito, who's going to take us through a deeper dive into shareholder engagement. Oh, I'm sorry, one quick note. I do see on our Q&A we've had a question, and these slides will be available after the presentation. So no need to take notes or screenshot along the way. Turn things over to Matt, who's going to take us through a deeper dive into shareholder engagement. Matt?
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew, and good morning, all. If Rachel's section really sets up the stage of the Say on Pay season and what we've seen thus far, this section takes you into the next steps of what to do with the results. Shareholder engagement is a fundamental part of good corporate governance. We've always had shareholder engagement. We've always seen shareholder engagement in things like the proxy and the compensation discussion and analysis and the Say on Pay vote. But what we are seeing in recent years is a real divergence, particularly on Say on Pay, between what the proxy advisors say in their policy preferences and what institutional investors are ultimately voting on. And so in the context of 2023 proxy season, shareholder engagement has become increasingly important because institutional investor views are less homogenized, less following the proxy advisor prescriptions, and really going out on their own, which is making it a much more challenging job for corporate boards. So if we could go to the next slide, Andrew, I'll just kind of set the stage for what I'll be speaking about today. And really, when we're talking about shareholder engagement, we're talking about the why, the when, the who, and the how. I should also note, while today's focus is really on shareholder engagement in the context of Say on Pay, a lot of the learnings and strategies that I'm going to share with you in terms of practical things that our clients are thinking about with respect to shareholder engagement can also apply when it comes to director elections, when it comes to things like overboarding and diversity on boards, and really engaging with shareholders on those issues proactively as well. So in terms of the why, if we could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, institutional investor policy preferences have been diverging from proxy advisor preferences. Next slide, please, Andrew. It also, what we're seeing is every company has a different investor composition, and that's made it fundamentally harder for companies to keep track of different policy preferences. As a very simple example, we've seen in recent years European-based investors having very different perspectives and points of view on executive compensation programs generally. So in Europe, we tend to see pay structures that are more focused on fixed pay, salary, guaranteed pensions, and less on at-risk pay. And by consequence, the goals in the PSUs and in the long-term incentive programs tend to be a whole lot more rigorous because long-term incentives tend to make up a smaller proportion of pay. And one example is BMO Global Asset Management, which will actually vote against Say on Pay if you have a payout on your PSUs for the relative TSR portion of PSUs for below median performance. So it becomes increasingly important to understand the composition of your investor profile and how European-based investors versus North American-based investors vote on things like Say on Pay. But even within North America, we see some of the large institutions having very different perspectives on things like stock options and other elements of performance-based pay in the executive compensation regime. We often find too, one of the benefits of engagement is just getting better feedback. So with a Say on Pay result or a director election result, the vote outcome tends to be binary. You either passed Say on Pay or you didn't. you either achieve 90% support or you got something in the yellow card zone of 50 to 70%. And without that extra step of shareholder engagement, it's really hard to understand why your investors voted the way that they did. And so it becomes increasingly important to understand the why. And something that Rachel had mentioned in her proxy season update is 80% is the new 70% on Say on Pay. So proxy advisors expect much more robust engagement with shareholders when Say on Pay support dips below that 80% support level. If we could go to the next slide, please. The when and the how to engage. And I think this really depends on the circumstances of the engagement. There are three distinct rows here on this page. The first is really the one nobody wants to be in, which is when ISS or Glass Lewis recommend against Say on Pay, and potentially it's a surprise because you've done all of the quantitative pay for performance modeling. You weren't anticipating a pay for performance disconnect or concern from the proxy advisors, but hey, Glass Lewis said something was wrong with your pay programs in its qualitative analysis and recommended against Say on Pay. And we actually saw a whole lot of that this season, particularly from Glass Lewis. Abnormal and unexpected Say on Pay vote recommendations from that proxy advisor in particular. So what do? I think it really depends on the anticipated level of support at the AGM, and it really depends on your investor composition. So getting the IR team to work with the proxy solicitor and understand which investors vote with ISS, which investors vote with Glass Lewis, which investors vote with both, or which investors don't vote with either of those recommended proxy advisors. And that'll dictate how you engage with investors, and that'll dictate who you engage with in your investors. So as a simple example, let's take a case study where Glass Lewis has recommended against Say on Pay, and you understand that maybe 20% of your institutional investor base follows Glass Lewis recommendations on Say on Pay every time. And you can get that information from a proxy solicitor or from your investor relations team. Then what I conclude from that in that case study is you don't need to worry about the investors that more commonly vote with ISS or that don't follow Glass Lewis, but you can really focus on that 20% subset that do follow Glass Lewis. You can issue a supplementary filing. You can upload that supplementary filing to the Glass Lewis portal if you buy one of their reports, and that'll go directly to investors that vote aligned with Glass Lewis's recommendations. We actually have seen this to be a very effective strategy in terms of a supplementary filing to poke holes in the proxy advisor analysis and to provide well-documented counterpoints of view. And we actually have seen in some cases where issuing a supplementary filing has actually resulted in Glass Lewis and ISS changing their recommendations on Say on Pay in light of new disclosure, new facts and circumstances. The second, and this is the middle row on the page, is when you're past the AGM, you've received less than 80% support at the AGM, and you need to understand why. This is a much more robust, involved process that requires a lot of different players, both on the committee side and the board side, but also on the management side, and also with assistance from your compensation advisor. It's a multi-month process that effectively starts as soon as you receive the Say on Pay support levels. And it starts with an action plan to identify who should we be reaching out to in the off season, how do we reach out to them, and what do we want to say in that engagement. The ending part of this feedback loop is really summarizing that feedback and disclosing it in the proxy. And this is such a critical step, regardless of whether you think you're going to make compensation changes based on shareholder feedback or not. ISS and Glass Lewis, we've seen in the past, have acknowledged companies who just have very robust disclosure of shareholder engagement, have not made the changes that investors have sought out, because it's not fundamentally in the best interests of the business. And they will acknowledge that disclosure and give you credit for acknowledging and going through that shareholder engagement exercise. Of course, if you do make changes based on investor feedback, it's good to disclose those, and it's good to say this is in direct response to shareholder feedback. The final step is once you've summarized that feedback and disclosed it in a proxy, engaging with investors throughout the off season. Prior to the AGM. So now this is, you've filed your proxy, you've disclosed it in the next year's proxy, and you have a few weeks before the AGM. This could be an opportunity to walk investors through information that's now public in the public domain, and to close the loop on the engagement that you had in the off season. And actually, one thing I do want to point out in terms of one of the benefits here is, if you do engage with investors and they feel like they've been heard, they tend to have higher support for compensation programs in subsequent years, regardless of what the proxy advisors have to say in their reports. So ultimately, it's providing an avenue or an opportunity for your investors to be heard. Next slide, please, Andrew. In terms of who's involved, so I said this is really kind of a multifaceted approach. It really is led by the committee and the committee chair in terms of the discussion that they have with investors. Often we see the board chair involved in those discussions as well, in particular where the board chair can provide a broader perspective on things related to the business strategy, on things related to CEO performance. But really, it's the job of the board, being the committee chair and the board chair as a proxy, to provide the business context for any incentive design decisions made. The second is management. So HR is really responsible for being the primary architects of compensation programs. They should be providing materials that provide discussion points about how the compensation programs are aligned with performance, summarizing the critical facts of the executive compensation program in something like a compensation dashboard, which is a really helpful 1 to 2 page summary. In tandem with that, I spoke a little bit about the investor relations team and how they analyze investor composition and track what the proxy advisors, which investors vote with which proxy advisors. They'll also set up meetings with investors and know who to talk to at your largest institutional investors. And finally, your comp consultant should be able to do a lot of the supporting behind the scenes with management to provide talking points and to illustrate pay for performance alignment. In terms of who's engaged on the investor side, we typically say aim to talk to at least 10 to 15 investors, your top institutional investors by holdings, and really send invitations to all significant investors who are known to have opposed say on pay. So your IR team or your proxy solicitor can give you that information about which investors actually voted against say on pay last year. If we go to the last slide, please, Andrew, and then I'll wrap up. I would just like to reiterate here that in order to maximize some of the benefits of engagement, it really starts with being proactive in and anticipating some of the things that might crop up from investors in the next proxy season. So doing things like modeling pay for performance, using the ISS criteria for pay for performance modelings is really important. That'll help you anticipate the likelihood of a pay for performance disconnect. Doing a red, yellow, green analysis to understand what's green, what's yellow, and what are the things in red that investors may have a particular challenge about. And maybe a final piece in a trends report, it's also good to just summarize what institutional investors you have, your top 10 institutional investors, and what they care about on things like say on pay, on things like director elections with respect to overboarding and gender diversity. So doing that on an annual basis and being proactive can really help you maximize the benefits of shareholder engagement. So I'll pause there, hand it over to you, Andrew, and happy to take any questions on shareholder engagement at the end of this session.
Great, thank you, Matt. That's very interesting. Certainly a lot of different considerations at play, and it sounds like it's worth sitting down as a company to make some kind of plan, even if it is a pretty loose one at first, around who those key players are that need to be involved, especially if the company does need to pull the red lever and kick into a really rapid response engagement campaign at some point. So next up, keeping on the general subject of shareholders, Andrew McElhern is going to be discussing how activist investors may present some unique challenges compared to other investors and what we might need to know to prepare for them. Andrew?
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be with you all this morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Andrew number 2. I'll talk for a few minutes about activists and then turn it over to Andrew number 3 to finish it off this morning. So we go to the first slide, please, Andrew. So sort of table setting, why are we talking about this now? Corporate activism has been a regular feature in North America for many years now, but conditions may be a little different right now because anytime you're after a crisis, history tells us that creates fertile ground for investors with an activist bent to seek, identify, and work on targets of opportunity for them. Anytime there's turbulence or volatility in the macro environment, that creates targets of opportunity. Or to paraphrase Warren Buffett, who once said, when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked. And activists and investors like to identify those naked swimmers. Moreover, we note on this page, there have been some changes in the regulatory landscape in both Canada and the United States, a little different in each jurisdiction, but the common theme is it's easier now to identify and make changes to a board of directors based on the way that corporate director elections are held in both countries. So that reduces some friction and probably makes it easier for activists to do their work. If we go to the next page, Ace. Yeah, so just taking one step back, what is activism and why do we care? Moving from the left side of the page to the right, it gets increasingly more complicated. But basically, if you think about activism as opposed to passive investors, where an investor decides this is something, a company that I'd like to invest in, and they either stay there or if they're unhappy, they get out. Activists, by contrast, see an opportunity to change corporate behavior, and their position in a company stock is predicated on that opportunity. What they are after usually is an opportunity to profit. Sometimes, and we think this will increase in the future, it's an opportunity to change the way the world is ordered a little bit. The tactics that are used are generally some kind of change in strategic direction, or that's really the change that is sought. Sometimes it's a bit more limited, some improved financial performance or some more modest capital changes, or it could be a change in governance. And then at the right, we have the most variability. How an activist will behave will depend a lot on how they perceive their entry point and their strategy for pursuing a position in a company. So it could be private, could be public, could be more or less legalistic, could be adversarial, or could be more collaborative with the management team. So it will depend based on the facts and circumstances for each company. As we go to the next slide, though, when we think about numbers and then talk about what might be a little different now, unquestionably, there was a dip in activist campaigns at the beginning of the pandemic. 2021 was down. 2022 saw a pretty significant surge back in Canada, 64 campaigns recorded by Insightia. That's about a 20% increase over 2021, and a much higher number in the United States, closer to 900 campaigns in the US. What's interesting, and this theme will come back, is relatively few of these campaigns globally had to do with executive compensation. Many more had to do with, if you like, other issues, including ESG. But as noted in the themes at the right side of this page, talking about executive compensation as one of the predicates for the activist campaign, that's pretty common. And that really is why we're talking about it here today. Moving to the page that follows, so some themes on this page reinforce the idea that activism as a feature of corporate life might be here to stay, and some changes we've seen that might make it a more prominent feature of corporate life than has been the case historically. If you look at the pie chart on the right, what that says is, depending on how you're doing your counting, around half, a little more than half the time, when an activist campaign is launched, it's because they are seeking a strategic change in direction, often expressed as buy something or sell something. not necessarily though. So the ultimate goal might be similar to the past, but some other trends that we observe include maybe more investors that are more active than they have been historically, if not meeting the historical definition of an activist. An increase in shareholder proposals is one example of that phenomenon. Definitely the case, more campaigns targeted at large cap, even mega cap companies, which is a fairly new phenomenon. Historically, you might have thought as activism was for mid cap or smaller companies, and large cap companies didn't have to worry so much. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Partly that's an artifact of investor syndicates, what has been described as wolf pack activism. So multiple investors banding together, which gives them more scale and opportunity to go after very large companies. And if you retreat to more typical grounds such as mid-cap or smaller cap companies, a term called SPACtivism has been in the conversation recently. Essentially, companies that went public via reverse IPO or RTO type transactions without having necessarily the financials and the valuation to support being a public company. More of those are in trouble in this more turbulent environment. And so we may see more activism taking place with those companies that went public via SPAC transactions. Definitely more usage of ESG broadly defined as the starting point for an activist launching their campaign. This gets back to where does the line end between an active and engaged shareholder and an activist shareholder? Well, ESG could be one of the places where if you broaden your definition, you see a lot more companies defined or a lot more investors defined as activists. And also interesting, more companies essentially working out a deal with the activist after it takes a position in their stock. Our reflex here is to treat activism as something to be avoided, but it could be a fair statement to say it doesn't have to be adversarial or confrontational. And there's evidence that companies have come to fairly quick agreements with activists and made some changes to the way their organizations were set up. If you're on the hunt for when would become a target for an activist, really it's inferior performance on a variety of dimensions, either top line growth or margin compression, particularly compared to other companies. Those are sort of the calling cards for when you might expect an activist to come around. We can move to the next page, Ace. So it's probably unfair, but we think it's absolutely the case that the executive pay program will be an obvious and natural jumping off point for an activist looking to build an argument for why other investors should follow them. And the through line on this page and on the pages that follow is really an argument that this company, for a series of potential reasons, has not done a good job aligning pay and performance. And when you break that down further, it could be the performance goals are not particularly aggressive or interesting. It could be that the definition of market, the yardsticks used to set executive pay, are set inappropriately, or it could be simply that you're ignoring those yardsticks and there's poor governance taking place, which when combined with an argument about, and you're spending too much of shareholders' capital and diluting them as part of the process, that starts to get a bit more powerful. But the through line, to restate it, is misalignment between pay and performance. So we'll go to the following page. If you have this set of facts, or you think you might, we bring the question, so what is to be done about this? Fortunately, Matt Cito a few minutes ago gave probably the first and best way to anticipate and head off critiques like this, and that's to understand your shareholders, what their goals and policies are, and if you have had say on pay problems, to understand what might be behind those say on pay problems, which speaks to proper outreach on the executive pay program as a regular ongoing feature of the broader investor relations program, not solely when you have a say on pay failure that prompts a need for a targeted campaign. This is more on a regular basis, being in touch with shareholders and understanding what they're after and if they have executive pay policies that you should be thinking about. Moving down the list, the next obvious places for us and the companies we work with are put that to the test. If there's an argument that there's a pay for performance misalignment, does that argument have any weight to it or not? And there are some analyses that I'll show in a moment that are one of the ways we try and demonstrate that a misalignment exists or doesn't exist. But that's the next most important way to defend yourself against the prospect of an activist coming in and changing things. A related point is if you have an executive team that doesn't have enough skin in the game via their own share ownership, that's an easy problem to fix. And lastly, perhaps the hardest problem to fix is if there's some question as to whether the performance goals and the incentive plans are rigorous enough. That's harder to address, but that's another place where there's plenty of opportunities for many companies to do better. The last 2 pages in my section then, this one here is 2 anonymized examples from work we have done with our clients. One, a standard pay for performance evaluation. I would note here for both of these, the first step is do the analysis and see where you stand. The second step, and not necessarily a step that you would want to take, but worth discussing is, okay, we've done the analysis and we think there's alignment. Should we share that with shareholders via our proxy circular filing or some other method? We generally say the first is good practice for all companies to consider. The second, whether you disclose this and make that part of your narrative, that takes a bit more conversation. There are trade-offs to consider, but more companies will be considering whether to do this in the future. The example at the right is what we have called the millions for billions analysis. So in this example, the subject company handed close to $100 million of compensation to the CEO over a period of time, which standing alone is a very impressive number. But in context, it represented about 1% of the increase in market cap that shareholders saw over the same time period. So in perspective, it makes a better case that what shareholders got was actually a good deal for their money. And then the last slide I will speak to, which if you've attended Meridian webinars in the past, or if we work with you, you've often seen this, a diagram like this with the roulette wheel, where evaluating rigor and performance goals is something that many companies have the ability to improve at. It is complicated and it needs to be tested through several lenses. But these sorts of topics in the various icons around the circle here are things that an activist is likely to be interested in. So you'll do yourself a favor and ultimately maybe do the activist a favor as well by considering how those performance goals are set and based on a series of evaluative techniques if you've got proper rigor in them. And with that, I look forward to questions if there are any, and I'll hand it over to Andrew, number 3.
Thanks for that, Andrew. That really feels like one of those fractal pattern shaped domains where, the more we dig into all these granular nuances of particular investors and particular strategies, the more complex interconnections we end up uncovering. But it's really beneficial to have these overarching guidelines and give us some kind of a framework to help understand how their motivations might be different than what we're used to, and help us craft strategies and plan designs and disclosure messaging or non-disclosure messaging that resonates with that audience. So that really, really interesting stuff. Our final scheduled speaker today will be the third Andrew of the day, as we've alluded to, Andrew Stansel, who's going to discuss CEO transitions. So take it away, Andrew.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Andrew. Hello, everyone. The average tenure of a CEO is about 5.5 years today. So almost every board member deals with this at some point, once or twice during their tenure. So this is a really important topic to get right. At the outset, I do want to acknowledge that CEO succession is really a governance topic, but compensation is an important aspect of the process. The two are really closely linked. Next slide, Andrew. Compensation programs and policies really support successful CEO transitions. And it's not just around pay for the new CEO upon the actual transition, but throughout the whole process, from before the CEO leaves and also afterwards. When we look at compensation perspectives before the CEO leaves, there are ways to be more planful before the actual transition. One thing is thinking about your potential internal candidates, setting them up appropriately with performance and development plans, and that ties into compensation. How can you pay those individuals to support that development and that process? One approach might be moving the candidate closer to CEO pay over time rather than waiting until the actual transition, but that's specific to unique circumstances. Other things you can do are benchmarking your severance plans and retirement provisions. That's crucial to avoid obstacles that might hinder a smooth transition in the future. Your internal candidates will feel that they're treated fairly whether they get the CEO job or not, if you've got market-aligned severance. It also helps you take a close look at your retirement provisions. And this is important because if cash severance and equity is more valuable in, say, a termination without cause, it might be really challenging to get an individual to retire when it's best for the company. You don't want to create a barrier for an individual to depart when it's appropriate. Tally sheets are a great tool to illustrate what's due upon different termination scenarios, and I would really recommend using them. Another thing you can do is think about equity vesting as a tool to incent the right thinking and behaviors before your CEO exits. Companies want CEOs to think about the long-term value of the organization up until their very last day in the office. And this objective can be achieved through that continued vesting. And then finally, while not a direct compensation element, mandatory notice periods is a policy that comes into play before CEOs leave. For the new CEO, on the actual transition, understand that the total compensation envelope is really going to vary significantly based on whether whether you have an internal promote or you're bringing in an external hire. External hires may require sign-on awards or kickers, buyouts of incentive awards that they're leaving on the table at their current employer. And this can get really costly. So think in advance about some parameters around the costs. But of course, be prepared for negotiations on the final compensation package. In terms of afterwards, you want a smooth exit for the departing CEO and sometimes access to that person afterwards. This really comes into play maybe when you have a CEO founder or a CEO that's strongly linked to the company's brand. Compensation can help promote that access and foster a different type of relationship after the CEO leaves. And I'm going to speak to this a little bit more in a few minutes. And then finally, a compensation policy that's useful afterwards is restrictive covenants. That really incents behaviors after departure. Next slide, please, Ace. Okay, so let's assume you're ready to replace your current CEO with a new candidate. The source of that candidate might be an internal promote from the executive team with no prior CEO experience. When promoting internal candidates, there's often a multi-year transition period where you're gradually aligning the candidate's compensation with CEO level benchmarks. So what's happening is the new CEO would receive an initial pay package that is lower than their predecessor and the CEO benchmarks. And then what happens is compensation is increased to market, say, over about 2 to 3 years as the executive becomes fully experienced and as performance warrants. This is usually not set in stone. The board typically has discretion to accelerate or decelerate that stepped approach as needed. Equity grants might be topped up to CEO benchmarks depending on the time of the promotion. The other thing you want to consider is often it's a horse race for the job, so there may be other candidates. You may need to consider some type of retention for the also-rans that did not make it, or potentially transition those people out of the organization. Alternatively, you might look for an external candidate when the internal candidates don't play out. Generally, the approach for an external hire with no prior CEO experience is similar to the internal promote. It's a promotion, so you can bring that person in with lower pay and step them up to the CEO benchmarks over time. For an experienced CEO recruited externally, companies will generally need to offer market competitive pay at the outset. And for this, the candidate's actual compensation will also influence the company's offer. However, in both external hire cases, it might be necessary to provide some other additional compensation. And these awards tend to be incumbent specific. They might include things like a buyout or a make whole compensation or payment for equity or other incentives that are forfeited at the former employer. Or it might also be some type of initial award or premium to persuade the candidate to make the change. One parameter for these awards, for these other make whole or initial awards, is what you're willing to pay. And negotiations are often needed. Typically, your investors will generally understand that these make whole or higher payments are a cost to the hire. But be aware of your equity plan limits as you make any of these special awards, and aim for deferred vesting as well as performance criteria for these awards. Overall, I'd say try to adhere to your current pay philosophy, but unique circumstances may require extra or different pay. But you generally want to be careful to maintain consistency with the broader executive team's incentive structure. Finally, you might also need to consider some type of retention for your current executive team. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, let's focus on considerations for the outgoing CEO. Frankly, smooth successions do require some involvement from the person leaving, and there are roles and compensation to support those transitions. For an outgoing CEO, it boils down to 4 potential roles. 3 of these support situations where the outgoing CEO has ongoing value that's recognized by the board, the rest of the executive team, by your investors. And so you want access to that outgoing CEO. Historically, these roles were used as an opportunity to deliver additional value to the outgoing CEO. But now these are real roles that the board has determined add value from continued service, especially when you have an untested new CEO that needs a lot of advice and development support. As you move from left to right on this slide, the ongoing roles differ in terms of involvement and compensation costs, from most employed and the most expensive to least employed. The most involved is when the person moves out of the CEO role, but remains an employee and steps into the executive chair role. The former CEO is usually still very active in strategy, gets more involved in governance and board oversight, but is less involved with operational aspects of the business. In this case, the chair is not independent, so you might need to consider appointing an independent lead director to fill the responsibilities where the executive chair is conflicted, and then provide some type of director pay premium to support that lead role. The role is usually temporary, but that can mean anything from a few months to, say, 2 or 3 years. And sometimes it's actually a more permanent as part of the company's ongoing leadership and governance model. Compensation to support this role is the most complicated. There's a wide variety of approaches and varying time periods involved. Pay is usually determined on a case-by-case basis, unique to the nature and the role of the individual circumstances. But overall, executive chairs are paid like CEOs, but typically at a somewhat reduced rate. And pay is often thought of as a percentage of the CEO pay. And I'll give you an example. Salary and target bonuses are typically continued, but at reduced rates. The role's smaller, so the pay should be smaller. And we often see salary at, say, 60 to 80% of the prior CEO salary. And we see new target bonuses usually somewhere in the range of 50 to 80% of the prior target. LTI is different. It's based on the scope of the role and the needs of the organization. We usually see existing equity continue to vest, but overall new LTI is somewhat less prevalent than the other pay elements, given the role is often temporary. So new LTI with long vesting performance periods may not make a whole lot of sense. Finally, the role usually diminishes over time. So your compensation should diminish over time as well. Next, we have the advisory relationship. This is where the former CEO has a much less active involvement with the company, but the company still wants access to the CEO's expertise. And creating an advisory relationship provides a mechanism to compensate the former CEO for being on call and available as needed. Compensation for this role is usually a monthly stipend, very similar to salary, but usually significantly reduced and depends on the scope of the work. Existing equity usually continues to vest, but there's usually no new equity. We're seeing a lot more pen to paper on what the expectations are for this role. The final ongoing role involves becoming a non-employee director. The company wants the CEO to be involved in a more typical board role as steward of the company. For this director role, the CEO simply rolled into the existing director compensation program. The fourth and final role on this slide is it's retirement, really. It's where you have an orderly separation. It's planned ahead of time with no ongoing service or relationship with the company after the exit. In this scenario, it's really about documenting and tallying what the CEO has upon retirement and maybe considering enhancing the value of long-term equity to enable a more smooth transition out. Next slide, please. So I've been talking a lot about planned departures, but sometimes the best laid plans do go astray due to unexpected changes. For example, business conditions might change and your CEO is lured away. Your CEO might experience health issues and needs to step away. And these situations can strike like lightning in a blue sky. But there is some pre-planning you can do. Have a point person identified that will lead the process around an unexpected departure. Make sure your succession plan identifies your emergency candidate that can step into the role. And don't rush to fill the role. Rather, consider an interim CEO to fill the role. This is a best practice in the market. And compensation supports that interim role and the transition. If you have a board member stepping into the interim role, it's likely just some cash compensation similar to a CEO salary, prorated over the time the member is in the role. You might consider an equity grant with a shorter vesting period, but overall, the structure should allow for an ease of transitioning back to regular board pay. For a management team member stepping into the role, think about one-off arrangements that are easily removed for a transition back to the executive's prior role. Sometimes the interim CEO becomes the permanent hire, and in this scenario, you can apply some of the principles I talked about earlier under internal promotes and external hires. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this part of the briefing with just highlighting a few other considerations and potential traps. First, for public companies, expect scrutiny. We're seeing much more scrutiny on pay arrangements for departing CEOs as well as on new hire packages. Think about how you'll be able to explain and defend these your arrangements in your public disclosures. Second, if you're contemplating any pay enhancements when the CEO leaves, be aware that investors and proxy advisors have focused on this area in recent years. If it's an involuntary departure, you'll be well served to call it what it is and pay market-aligned severance without too many enhancements. We acknowledge this may be difficult to do in practice, and we're sympathetic to that, but excess severance or making terms more favorable are problematic practices the proxy advisors will take note of and investors tend to follow. If it's a friendly departure, this is a place to avoid paying cash severance as you're essentially paying someone to retire. Rather use equity as a tool to enhance the value of unvested long-term equity. Some companies make this tool explicit and set formal policies saying, here is what we will do for you if you retire as a good leaver, but Other companies leave this as pure board discretion to assess a good leaver situation at the time. There's no set rule here. There are valid arguments for both approaches. A few other things, don't forget about potential adverse accounting implications if you enhance or modify any of your in-flight equity awards. Caution about retention awards. They can be useful, but, and I mentioned them earlier, but be careful about the magnitude and the design of the awards. This is also a problematic practice the proxy advisors will take note of. And then finally, communicate with your shareholders. During CEO transition, engagement with shareholders can secure confidence, investor confidence, and support. And transparent and comprehensive disclosure really helps to build trust and alignment with your shareholders. Thank you. All right, back to you, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Andrew. That's really interesting. Perhaps more than any of the other topics, something that really does, at the end of the day, come down to kind of facts and circumstances and, you know, the appropriate thing to do for the business at that moment. But always super helpful to get these overviews of, you know, what is common, what is typical, what is less so, and, you know, what has been well received by the markets in the past. So pivoting now, as we have a few minutes left before our scheduled time elapses on us, to our Q&A section. I have a couple of questions that have come in over the course of the discussion so far. I think the easiest way to handle this, I'm going to direct them first and foremost to one of my colleagues based on the subject matter that they were covering and the timing of when the question arrived. But I certainly would invite anyone from Meridian to jump in and provide some color and context afterwards. We can treat this like a little bit of a panel chat. So first and foremost, we have a question pertaining to all the way back to Say on Pay at the beginning of the discussion. We're seeing that, well, fundamentally, how much stock should we be putting in proxy advisor recommendations going forward if there's this erosion of the connection that we've historically seen? You know, how do we feel about that? And I guess I'll put this to Rachel, I suppose.
Thanks, Andrew. So we know that, you know, ISS has historically had more prominence and influence than Glass Lewis, and that likely will remain the case moving forward. But I think the key takeaway from our discussion here today is that investor policies and preferences should take precedence over those of the proxy advisors. You know, each company's composition of institutional investors looks very different. So we understand, you know, that it makes it harder to manage moving from 2 proxy advisors issuing vote recommendations to 5 or 10 institutional investors who all have differing opinions on things like director elections and Say on Pay. So we would advise the companies be proactive and engage with their top shareholders to really understand their preferences and ensure that these investors understand the rationale behind compensation design at the company.
Oh, that makes sense. And there's probably some opportunity to track those things more thoughtfully and have that longitudinal information on how closely or loosely that linkage proves itself to be for your company in particular. You know, it's always interesting to see these broader market and aggregate trends, but you know, when the rubber meets the road, it can be helpful to have that information on your own facts and circumstances. So next then, we have a question pertaining to the shareholder engagement. So this one's going to be for Matt. What's the best way of finding out which investors voted against Say on Pay?
Perfect, thanks. Great practical question. And the easiest answer is typically a proxy solicitation firm will be able to give you that information. So what they will do, they'll track in their database which investors actually vote aligned with ISS and which investors vote in alignment with Glass Lewis. So they'll have the historical point of view. But my understanding is they'll actually marry that up with going to each of the institutional investor websites and actually scraping voting records to determine whether they voted for or against the Say on Pay proposal or director elections. Not every large institutional investor will have or disclose that type of information, particularly if you have smaller ones. So I would complement that through the management team, in particular the IR team, to actually in their conversations with portfolio managers at institutions to simply ask, did you vote for or against say on pay? And you can supplement the analysis that the proxy solicitation firm has provided with any anecdotes you get from that investor engagement.
Makes sense, and probably speaks to the importance of that ongoing engagement, not just in the moment, but being able to draw on those contacts and spin those things up when the time comes. Here's an interesting one that sort of verges between those two, the subjects of proxy disclosure and shareholder engagement, I should say, and say on pay. To what extent do they call it say on pay? Do we think it's really say on pay programs, or is this just an opportunity shareholders have to voice their displeasure potentially with company performance if things aren't going well? I might actually direct this one to Chris, because I think it's a little bit less about statistics and more about, what do we think is going on in the minds of the those making these vote decisions.
Certainly low votes. So say on pay failures, votes below, say 60% are heavily influenced by company performance. Votes in that sort of yellow card zone may just be more based on investors following proxy advisors. But we see companies with very strong performance, very infrequently getting recommendations against say on pay because they pass both proxy advisors' quantitative testing. But even when they do, the impact of those proxy advisors is certainly muted by strong performance. So you are most vulnerable when you have poor share price performance, particularly relative to other companies in your industry. That increases the risk of a proxy advisor recommendation against just based on their quantitative testing, and also increases the chances that investors, whether or not they follow the proxy advisors, are likely to express their unhappiness about performance. And I think probably we are at time and should thank everybody for attending. Thank you all very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Please, if you have questions or follow-ups, send them to us. We're more than happy to respond.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We do appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.